1 second. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Jenny Galuzzo. I'm one of the co-founders of The Second Shift, and this is our third member-led event. And the response to this series has been really enthusiastic, and we are excited to showcase today a different member each month. And today it's our honor to have Kalyn Wilson hosting this talk. Kalyn is our June featured member. She's an HR expert who focuses on diversity and inclusion, and she recently launched a one-on-one coaching business as well as doing groups. We are thrilled to help her launch this business through this talk today, which is called Strong Foundations, a crash course on being an ally to Black folks. We know that this will bring our community even closer together. So I'm gonna let Kalyn take over and lead this discussion. Everyone's on mute, but you can use the Q&A feature if you have any questions you'd like addressed. We're going to reserve time at the end to have Kalyn address those questions. Also, I just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded and it's going to be posted later. So you should change your name or make yourself anonymous if you want to protect your privacy and feel empowered to ask any personal questions or share stories that you don't feel like sharing publicly. Thank you all. Please share this outside the Second Shift community once it's posted. And with that, I'll say welcome, Kalyn, and thank you so much for taking your time and generously hosting this. And we're excited to launch your business. So it's an honor. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone who's attending today. I'm extremely excited about everything that we're going to discuss, all the information that you're going to hear. But I also know that it has been an extremely heavy time really throughout the entire year. I mean, 2020 has not let up. And so, in order to prepare our minds to even be in a calm place to hear, I actually want to start with just a really quick exercise. I'm not sure where everyone is right now, but if you can, I'd like for all of us to just kind of center ourselves and reach like a plateau of peace so that we have a really strong foundation to even start hearing. So I'm going to do a quick breathing exercise. And so I want you to breathe in for 3, but out for 5, because we want to release some of that tension. Okay. So I'm going to count us off in a second. And again, you're going to breathe in for 3 seconds. And then you're going to hold it for a second. And then we're going to breathe out for 5. We're going to just do that one time to, again, just kind of bring us all to a calm space. So I'm going to start that now. And you're going to breathe in now. And that's 1, 2, 3, hold. And then breathe out for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Thank you so much. I hope that helped a little bit. I think that's also helpful for us because the information that we're going to hear, to be quite honest, some of it is a little heavy. And so I want to honor the fact that for some of you, you're going to be processing things that you've heard a lot of times. And for some people, you're going to be processing information that you've never heard. And in both cases, that doesn't make it any less traumatized. It was hard for me to even write some of this. So this is Strong Foundations, and it's just what it said, a foundational course to understand how to become an ally. It's interesting, when I first created the course, I said being an ally, and then I realized that you never really quite arrive at that. And that's for any dimension of diversity, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race and ethnicity or any part of our identity. We never arrive. It's always a state of becoming. So with that being said, we're just going to have 5 key sections. We're going to talk about why now. So why is this even important? And then we're going to go through some definitions of some key terms that you'll hear me use and that you've probably heard used in the media. And some of you may be wondering, well, what does that really mean? We're also going to talk timelines and a couple of key events in Black history, particularly for Blacks in America. And then we're going to talk about how to understand the layers and the rewards and the impact of bias. And then I'm going to tell you some action items for now. So what can you do right now to set a foundation to become an ally for Black folks? So why now? Excuse me. Of course, there has been an escalation of tension just in general because of the extended stay-at-home orders. Plainly put, everybody is stressed the hell out. It is intense. People are tired of being in the house. We've been afraid. We don't really know what to expect. And so all of that tension has compounded which then led to increased tension due to recent deaths, specifically connected to police brutality of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, but also the unjust murder of Ahmaud Arbery from some neighbors or, some people in the community. And then there's also the increased visibility of police violence just due to recording and social media sharing. So plainly put, we're all anxious because we have to see and watch this rather than just hearing about the story secondhand later on. There's also a widespread sensitivity to social causes that's due to social media visibility and connection. And so because we're all on social media, we're constantly hearing about movements, about issues that are happening across multiple communities, but in particular, violence and brutality against the Black community from all forms. And this also includes other types of injustice like economic injustice, cultural appropriation, and some other issues of discrimination, which we'll talk about a little bit later in today's session. And then finally, as you all know, more and more businesses are becoming involved in social issues. And so whereas before corporations were very good at saying we're hands off, they might just quietly donate money, or they may quietly have talent acquisition efforts at different places or through different nonprofits. But in general, people weren't going so hard about the public statements the way they are now. Because that's happening, this is affecting what we're able to do even as far as entertainment. So we're seeing the commercials, we're seeing the ads, we're seeing the social media accounts and posts, and all of that is making a difference in how we are able to separate ourselves and compartmentalize these issues. So let's talk a few definitions, and I'm going to read from my paper for this because I want to make sure that I capture everything. So in a second, you're going to see me put my head down a little bit. So first, let's talk about what is allyship, right? So what does it actually mean to attempt or become an ally to a particular community? First of all, allyship is an ongoing state of support. So it means that you're constantly doing it, and it means that you constantly have to show up. And this is particularly for underrepresented groups. So, for women, we are very familiar with the definition of allyship because we expect men to show up for us consistently. So if you're only nice, for example, to your partner, but mean to your colleagues, we wouldn't consider you an ally to women because you've cherry picked where you wanted to show up and how you wanted to show up. So there is a spectrum of support that's going to define the level of allyship to which you ascribe. And it's also going to determine how people are able to see and connect with you as an ally. Again, it's not about you cherry picking, and I can't stress that enough, because in order for you to be an ally, the group to which you are saying you are forming an alliance has to validate your allyship, not you yourself. So the 4 pillars of allyship are visibility. So can we actually see you doing things? So this is beyond, and sorry, let me adjust my chair. So this is beyond the social media post. This is beyond just, screaming out Black Lives Matter when you're driving down the street. This is showing up every day at work, the way you interact with the barista, the way you interact with the cashier, the way you interact with your friends and family. Can people see you being an ally to the Black community? Second, we want to talk about consistency. If you're an ally only when people can see you, or you're an ally only on the weekends, or you're an ally only when it's comfortable for you and you don't have to make a personal sacrifice, that's not quite allyship, because again, it's still you choosing based on your own comfort level. And then third, authority. Like I said earlier, you can call yourself an ally, but you cannot validate your allyship. The underrepresented community has to validate your allyship. And I think that we've seen some of that, like, for example, with the Amy Cooper situation, and just other issues where these are people who may have voted for Barack Obama, or they're a part of the Democratic Party, or, they didn't, they might have a Black person who works on their staff. But then when there's these other situations where, again, they feel like they are justified in their actions, you can see what ends up coming of that. And so as the Black community speaking out, we would then say, no, that person is not an ally because they only show up in this one area, but these other 5 where they could have shown up, they've done a poor job. So a huge part of this is the way you choose to interact with people in the Black community in order to have your allyship validated. And that's where that consistency and visibility comes from too. Because if you're only validated as an ally by the white people that you know, that's not true validation. And I know sometimes it's kind of tough for people to see and tough for people to accept, but that is a really important part of this. And we're going to get to why in a second, a little bit later, when we talk about the timeline, because a lot of that has to do with power and the ways in which we wield power in order to make ourselves feel better about things. And so finally, flexibility is a pillar of allyship. What may have been considered allyship in 1992 may not be considered allyship today. And I think that's true for all underrepresented groups. Again, I go back to women. You know, what may have been considered being an ally to women even 5 years ago. Now it's like, no, I don't want to hear that. So if you were advocating for equal pay, but now when we're talking about reproductive rights, you kind of hemming and hawing, oh, I don't know, I'm this, I'm that, I have this perspective. That's not allyship, because what the underrepresented group has now determined is important. You as the ally have to be flexible to get with that. So an example for the Black community is, if previously you say, yes, I think that Black people should be able to get home mortgages. I think it's horrible that systemically they were kept from being able to own a home. Great, that's awesome. That was a huge thing in like 2008, 2009 in the housing crash. But now today we're saying, look, police brutality is a problem. And in fact, we want to redirect funds from the police to the community so that we can do more community building rather than community policing. If you now say, well, you know what, oh, I can't get with that, technically that's not allyship, because the community, the underrepresented group, has now determined that this is the pillar of allyship. This is the important point now. And we're checking your allyship against this point to see if you are on the same page as us around this issue. So again, visibility, can we see you? Consistency, how frequently do you show up as an ally? Authority, who is validating your allyship? And flexibility, how willing are you to move and pivot when necessary in order to continue to show up as an ally? And so the focus is on partnership and progress, not performance. You may make incremental progress in this goal to become an ally. It could be a change in mind. It could be an action you take. It could be a hire you make. It could be a promotion that you give to someone who you know is deserving. It is incremental steps that, again, would be according to these four pillars, which is visibility, consistency, authority, and flexibility. It's not about the performance. It's not about the big fireworks. It's about those small things that you do every day when you have the chance to show up that makes it most powerful. All right. So now I'm going to get into my paper with the definitions, and I'm going to read through these a little quickly, but I wanted to set a foundation so people can understand what these words mean, because this comes up so much. These words become buzzwords in pop culture, and people really, they lose their original meaning and they become kind of bastardized, to be quite honest. And there's one in particular I'm going to talk about when we get there. So the first is ally. We talked about allyship, which is like the state or condition of being an ally. But simply put, an ally is a supporter with mutual benefit in mind. So contrary to what some people think, it's not that Black people are asking for white people to become destitute in order for us to have the lion's share, right? That's a perverted mindset toward that, that shows, I would say, their own bias, and I'll just leave it at that. The purpose of us advocating for equality and equity is so that we can be able to have a fair chance to live the same quality of life that white people have been allowed to live, particularly in this country, but really worldwide, since the beginning of time. That's simply it. And so I want to hinge on that mutual benefit, because it's not who's the winner, who's the loser. It's about leveling the playing field so that everybody has a chance to win. So anti-Blackness are policies and perspectives which are hostile toward Black people. And so this could include thinking that certain hair textures are bad and certain hair textures are good. This could mean that you are discriminating against someone for housing or a job. It could mean that you are discriminating against someone to be able to purchase something at your store. If it shows up as something that is against or hostile to Black people, whether physically, emotionally, financially, or psychologically, is anti-Black. Conversely, whiteness are the principles that are driven toward the benefit of white people. So for example, excuse me, certain facial features being considered more beautiful than others or preferred, which affects people's access to jobs, housing, and opportunity, that is a function of whiteness. Because in order for me to succeed, I have to align with what is considered a white ideal. Bias is defined as unreasonably hostile feelings or opinions about a social group. Excuse me, it's also defined as prejudice. And I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my sinuses, so I may cough a little bit. Um, and I want to focus on that word unreasonably. So I actually got that from the dictionary. And I don't agree with it because bias is actually quite logical. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when we get into understanding bias. But there is most definitely a logic behind bias. It's just not always morally right. So just keep that in mind. Discrimination is treatment or consideration of or making a distinction in favor of or against a person or thing based on group, class, or category rather than individual merit. So, for example, if I say only the people with red lipstick are considered pretty, I can't stand when people wear these other colors. That's discrimination. And anyone can discriminate against someone else. It could be on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, what school you went to, what your hometown is, what you're wearing. Anybody can discriminate. On the other hand, not everyone can be racist. And I'm going to get to that in a second when we reach that definition. So diversity is defined as the simple presence of multiple identities in a group. So it's really a counting game. So if we have 10 people and we have two Black people, two white people, two Asian people, two indigenous people, and two people who identify as multiracial, technically we are diverse because there's an equal distribution of everyone, right? But on the other hand, when you think about the words inclusion and equity, which we'll get to in a second, those are a very different ball game. So equity is defined as shared ownership, recognition, and value in a group without requiring assimilation. So equity means that we all have the same opportunity to be recognized and seen and celebrated without having to change any part of ourselves to fit some norm. So an example of that would be the fact that a lot of Black women feel like they have to straighten their hair in order to succeed in corporate America. That is systemic inequity because I have to manipulate my hair and in some cases destroy my hair just in order to succeed at something when really it should be counted on my individual merit. Meaning if I have the education, the experience, and the skills, I should be able to succeed and my hair should not have anything to do with it. So inequity is when you have a system or rule or policy in place that requires people to assimilate from whatever their norm is to fit some other norm in order to succeed. Okay. And so inclusion is the shared experience in a group, excuse me, with multiple identities visible and recognized. So that means that people are there, they get a chance to participate, and they get a chance to be engaged with the group, not just simply present. So I want to make that distinction again. Diversity is the numbers game. How many do we have of each group? Equity is where we can all be in the group and it completely coexist as separate entities without anybody feeling like they have to change any part of themselves. And then inclusion is the opportunity to participate in the group and engage with the group and show up fully in the group, also without feeling the need to assimilate. Okay. So intersectionality, and this is the word that is buzzing around, but has been completely distorted from the original meaning. The original meaning of intersectionality is the term recognizing the layered bias, excuse me, of multiple identity categories. And it was initially developed specifically to highlight this phenomenon among Black women. So in particular, the ways in which being both a woman and being Black makes Black women a special and unique category of marginalized group in ways that white women or non-Black women, and in ways in which Black men or non-Black women do not have to deal with the same types and level of discrimination. It has now shifted to include things like poor people or poor people of color or other identity groups layered on top of one another, which again, it's fine, words do change meaning over time, but I really want to hone in on the fact that this was originally created by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw to highlight about Black women. And I think that's important because we're going to talk a little bit later about how things get tokenized and we end up being erased from these definitions, which end up benefiting more than just us. All right, so racism is a system of thought, action, or beliefs, excuse me, predicated on one group's superiority based on various characteristics, and it includes power dynamics and systemic interference. So this is what I meant when I said anybody can discriminate, but not everyone can be racist, because you cannot be racist unless you have the power and the access to restrict other people from doing something. And the only group that by and large has the ability to do that is white people. In some cases, you will see where non-Black people of color are able to be racist against Black people because maybe they have the power by owning businesses in the local community. So they can overcharge Black people for the necessities that they need because they don't have access to go someplace else at a fair price. That's an example of racist behavior. If you are restricting people from housing or overcharging people for housing because you own all the properties in the neighborhood, that is racist behavior. And so the converse of that is when you are anti-racist, that means that you are actively seeking to take actions which would purposely create a system of equity so that everyone has the same fair chance to live the same type of life. So that means that you charge everybody the same price, no matter what neighborhood you place your store. That means that you charge everybody the same level of rent, regardless of whether or not you have the opportunity to price gouge. And then finally, social justice is engineered equity, which includes redistributing economic, social, and political resources and benefits. So again, that is engineered. That means that we are purposely coming in, redistributing things, changing laws, changing policy, changing cultural values and norms in order to make sure that the way we handle our money, the way we handle our interpersonal dynamics, the way we handle our politics and our systems of government are fair and equitable for everyone involved. Okay. So I know that was a lot, but I really wanted to lay that foundation because, again, you're going to hear a lot of these words popping through media, on social media, and I want you to understand at its core what it means so that you can contextualize what you're going to be hearing. All right, so let's talk timeline. So Blacks in America have had a storied experience, and not in a good way. And so I want to say I took this in really huge chunks, but this actually could be broken out into much smaller pieces. And when I get to the action items, I'm going to talk to you about ways that you can leverage that to be able to learn more. But let's start with 1619. And if you're familiar with the New York Times study, you're probably familiar with the 1619 Project, which is where they did a lot of historical research to understand the story of Blacks in America. I would strongly encourage everyone to check that out if you have time. So starting in 1619, when the first Africans were kidnapped and enslaved in America, please keep in mind the language that I have chosen to use for this. The first Africans, not slaves, not enslaved people. They were living in Africa as free people, minding their business, doing whatever they were doing, and were forcibly kidnapped and brutalized and dragged to another country in order to become enslaved. And so those little language changes, that pivot in language makes a huge difference because it's person first and then status second. Okay, person first, status second. So this was per written record. There are tons of stories that show that there were likely large amounts of Africans in the Americas before this point, but this was the first documented case where African people were kidnapped for the purpose of slavery and brought to the American colonies. So then in 1793, right, so up to that point, slavery has been growing. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which made it a lot simpler to process cotton. And it exploded the slave trade and the US economy because now they needed more labor in order to do this work, in order to turn a profit. Also note, for my Hamilton fans out there, you'll know that 1793 is around the time where the US economy started to rebound from the American Revolution. So you're going to see this a lot as we talk about this timeline because economics has driven a lot a lot of what you see in terms of the way Black people are characterized. And so, to be perfectly honest, the Black and Indigenous community were the vehicles through which the white community rebounded from pretty much every major war or economic downturn. And that in particular is highlighted again in 1793 with the invention of the cotton gin. So then in 1831, you start to see the abolitionist movement explode. And in particular, excuse me, a man named William Lloyd Garrison started publicizing anti-slavery materials. And this is where you start to see names like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and other abolitionists, whether Black or white, becoming a lot more involved in this. And you also start to see things like Nat Turner's Rebellion and other slave revolts, which were designed to push back against the slave machine, which by this time had begun to stretch out even into the newly formed states. So this is when we're starting to move west, right? And it was just getting completely out of control. Also, I want to say by this time, technically, the US had banned importing more slaves. So importing, excuse me, more Africans to enslave. So technically, at this point, every single person that was living in America was somebody who was now a second or third generation a person of African descent who had now become enslaved. And that's important to note as well. So by the time we reach the 1860s, of course, we all know that it was a civil war. So the abolitionist movement is growing and it succeeds technically because enslaved people were now freed from slavery. However, one of the things that came about during this time was the idea of Black codes and what would eventually become the Jim Crow era. So this is like the beginning of that, like in the late 1860s. I also want to note that not all slaves understood that they were free at the same time. So a holiday, which is actually coming up this Friday, Juneteenth, commemorates the day when all enslaved people in America finally found out they were free, and that occurred in Texas. So it took Texas almost 2 years longer to actually notify slaves that they had been freed as of January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And so Juneteenth is a holiday, excuse me, to celebrate that announcement and the fact that now at this point, the entire country of enslaved people now knew that they were free by law. So in the 1870s, really all the way up to the 1920s, this is where we have the Reconstruction era, where we have the first elected Black congressperson. We have all of this extreme progress in racial relations, or so we think. But at the same time, violent white nationalism is also bubbling up. So this is when the KKK was officially formed. That's the Ku Klux Klan and other white terror groups, which we still see right now. So a lot of what we see in terms of white nationalism, white terror, white supremacy, ideas around white superiority were birthed not just in slavery, but particularly in this period in history. And this was a specific pushback to the idea that enslaved people should be free. I also want to note the foundations of this were not just social, not just political, but it was economic, because now instead of being able to use free labor, they were expected to pay people, which completely would bottom out profits. Plus, the South was completely decimated after the Civil War. And so they were having a lot of problems jumpstarting the economy. This is where you get into sharecropping. And I don't know if anybody has heard of sharecropping, but sharecropping would be the same as what we see happening in the Latinx community, where people are being severely underpaid and put into forced debt. It's like indentured servitude. So they were paid, if anything, pennies, and then charged in order to work on these former plantations. And so for a lot of people, they pretty much stayed in slavery even after they were freed, simply because of the sharecropping system, which eventually led to the 1920s, which is where you start to see the beginnings of the Great Migration, which is where you have millions, absolutely millions of Black people from the South moving north and pushing into cities like Detroit, which is my hometown, Chicago, New York City. It's where you start to see the birth of the Harlem Renaissance, St. Louis, and other towns, even starting to push further out west to the newly formed states there. This is important because from the 20s to the 70s, you see this huge shifts in Black oppression and then liberation movement. So you have the 1920s Harlem Renaissance and then the Great Migration beginning in the 1930s. Then you start to see what happens after World War II, where there starts to be some pushback in the beginnings of what would later become the civil rights movement, which was catalyzed by both Rosa Parks choosing to not sit in the back of the bus, but also the brutal murder of a teenager named Emmett Till in Mississippi. And then again, you just see this up and down, with it finally culminating with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then what we eventually would see as the Black Power movement in the 1970s. So this Black Power movement in the 1970s was huge because it gave people the chance to assert the fact that not only did Blacks deserve to have the same equitable experience in this country, but also that we deserve to be considered beautiful and be centered in what we saw in the media and in pop culture. And so you saw the rise of all types of things in music, movies, and all of these cultural elements, the same way you did in the 1920s Harlem Renaissance. So again, that was a huge time of up and down. So the 70s to the 90s, this is what I call the rise of hypercapitalism, hypercapitalist, expressions of Blackness. So this is where you see, and this was happening across all groups, but in particular for Black people, this is when you saw the rise of crack cocaine, which is where you see just, conspicuous consumption among drug culture. You also saw people, because of the Civil Rights Act, able to access being in the middle class at much larger numbers than before. So now people can own homes. They end up moving to the suburbs in order to escape what they perceive as urban blight. You also see people who are able to access, again, just the trappings of middle class life and affluence that weren't able to happen before. And so right here in this period is where you see the foundations of what we have come to know about the Black community now. And this is a lot of the discussions that are happening in the Black community right now in terms of buy back the Block movement, meaning moving back to these traditionally Black neighborhoods in order to preserve our culture or preserve our history and push back against gentrification. This is where you see movements like defining Blackness, and you have people arguing about what's Black enough and what's not. That's what I call, and a friend called, family business. So these conversations are happening in the Black community, and you may see them now either in, like, with the pundits going back and forth on TV and having debates. Sometimes you'll see it on social media. This is where this is coming from, because there's pushback around the flight and the, I'll say, the degradation of traditional Black culture from the 70s to the 90s in ways that, in a way, kind of violate the progress that was made from the 20s to the 70s. And then finally, you have the cultural renaissance, and this was through like gangster rap and urban genres, and just the ways in which Black people presented themselves and sought to preserve their culture again. And that was from the 1990s to the 2000s. So that was the era of like my childhood. I'm 35. So this is like what we love about like 90s R&B, 90s rap, and these just very distinct expressions of Black culture, which eventually came to be tokenized, culturally appropriated, and we'll get to that in a second. So then we reach, sorry, let me go back. There we go. Now we reach the 2000s. Okay, so that was a very long journey. And so in the 2000s, we start the era of what I call enmeshed erasure. Enmeshed erasure. And that is, now we are so mixed, right? So I make more money, so I get to live in affluent neighborhoods and I don't have to live, quote unquote, in the hood. Now I get to make money and I can go on vacations and feel like I've arrived. Now I get to do all these things, which now I've assimilated into whiteness, going back to some of the words we heard when we talk about the definitions. As a result of that, we lose what made us distinct as a culture. And as a result of that, we are now, as a Black community, faced with the idea that, oh my gosh, are we culturally becoming extinct? And that begins what I believe is a large part of the conversation around the resistance movements now, is that people are questioning what progress really looked like. So if progress was that I got to move to the suburbs, we're now seeing the consequence of that through gentrification, where you have cities and areas like Harlem, like parts of Chicago, like DC, that previously wouldn't even be touched by non-Black people because it was considered dangerous. And even for Black people to go was to run away from there because we bought into the idea it was bad. Now we're being priced out of those areas and they're booming again. So we have purposely given up our actual physical space and physical place in the world and are now at the mercy of other people. Second, we're talking about cultural appropriation. So these things like cornrows, certain hairstyles that now everybody's like, oh my God, it's so cool. Fun, funky nail designs, big bamboo earrings, ways of speaking and slang, even skin tone. You know, you talk about blackfishing and these things that are coming up now on social media, where previously Black people were completely denigrated for that. You know, I can say as a dark skinned woman, it wasn't until I was almost 30 that I was able to think that I was pretty. I grew up thinking that my skin was a horrible, horrible curse. And so to see people get so excited about their skin getting darker is like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. I didn't even know that that was supposed to be cool. And that's happening around all types of pieces of our cultural identity. Also tokenism. So this idea, and we see this now with everybody talking about the way corporations are responding to the resistance movements. You know, okay, you have one Black person on your board, but you have no Black middle managers. Like, what's up with that? What's happening with the entire system? We don't care about the twos and fews. We care about the systemic change that you're driving. And then finally, just flat out intrusion. And this happens a lot on social media, where people are literally able to just intrude, hop in conversations where, again, people are talking about very serious issues within the Black community and people just hop right in, troll, you know, push back, name call. And it's all a form of discrimination, it's a form of bias, but it also creates and erodes, psychological safety, because it's where can we feel safe? So we don't have a physical place. We don't have a cultural place. We don't necessarily have an economic place. And then finally, we don't even have places where we can just talk. And so again, all of that is enmeshed erasure, because as we become more enmeshed with white people and whiteness, we become less and less and we come to disappear. So let's talk about bias. There are three aspects to consider, and that is the layers, the rewards, and then the impact. I'll save. I'm not going to get into that because I don't think we'll have time, but that'll be in the expanded session. So the layers of bias, there are four. It's the cognitive and emotional side, and then it's individual and collective. So cognitive is like a thought, right? Maybe you hear something on the news. You hear 5 Black boys robbed a store in your neighborhood. That is a thought that you think about it because you heard information, and so your brain starts to process it. As a result of your brain processing that thought, you may feel a certain way. Maybe you feel angry. Maybe you feel violated. But then there's also the individual and collective side. So you are individually feeling that, but you are feeling that because as a group, perhaps considering yourself as a part of a neighborhood, now you're angry for the neighborhood. And if enough individuals in the neighborhood start to feel that way, now we have a collective push of bias. This is constantly happening in a loop, and it's happening about everything we hear. It's either thought or an emotion. Either one can happen first, and then we're thinking either as an individual or as a collective. So one way to unpack that and push back is to understand your locus of control and then act on it. So you cannot control your childhood. You can't control if your family was a racist growing up. You can't control if your friends were racist or if you never got a chance to interact with Black people positively when you were a kid. You also can't control what other people do, and you cannot control the way the mainstream media portrays Black people. But what you can control are your actions, unpacking your own difficult experiences. So if you did have really tough experiences with Black people growing up, or at different points in your life, unpack what that means. Was it because they were Black that this thing happened? Or was it because maybe they're just a mean person, or it was just some individual characteristic? Unpacking that really helps you to unpack your bias and unpack your stereotypes of certain groups. And then finally, you can always control your cross-cultural education. So what you choose to read, what you choose to ingest about Black people is absolutely in your locus of control. And then you want to manage your expectations and memories. Guess what? You're going to meet some great Black people, and you're going to meet some Black people that's going to get on your nerves. Just like I meet some white people who I think are absolutely lovely folks. And then I meet some white people and I'm like, you are like the embodiment of every stereotype of racist white people ever. It's individuals, right? And even if I met 100 white people that acted horribly racist, that still would not necessarily mean that white people as a whole are racist, because I have to unpack individual behaviors. That's my responsibility. Okay. So when we talk about power, power has four key elements, and power is really the reward of bias. Power has a social component, so I can choose who gets to talk, who gets to speak, who gets to be present in the room to interact and engage. It has an emotional reward, so I get to feel good when I tell certain people they can't come in the room, or when I allow other people, and I get to feel like the savior. It has a financial reward, so I get to make more money and I get access to capital to continue maintaining power and control. And then finally, it has a political reward, because when I have power, I get to choose what are the laws, what are the policies, and what people who can even vote to enact change. And we saw that in Florida with them choosing who would get a chance to have their voting rights restored, what level of felony. And as we know, around mass incarceration, Black and brown people, and Black and brown males in particular, are disproportionately put in jail, which means that they are disproportionately affected by those types of laws. So the impact of that, and there are 3 points to that, but the impact is that these systems of power end up being maintained. And so after you hear all of that, so you hear some definitions, you're like, okay, I never heard what that word meant. I never heard what that said before. You start to learn about the history of Blacks, and you're like, whoa, that's crazy. I never knew that. I want to learn more about that. You start to hear about bias, and now you're starting to unpack maybe some ways that you felt about Black people. Here are some actions you can take right now. First, you can choose to learn. And the first thing you want to do is immerse yourself in past and present Black thought. I take this for granted because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And so Detroit, when I was growing up, was overwhelmingly Black. I want to say it was like at least 85%, but it probably was like in the 90s. So I literally grew up seeing all Black people of all walks of life. So I saw poor Black people, homeless Black people, rich Black people, Black people in political positions, Black people who, were male people. Like I just saw Blackness. And so even in school, we read Black authors. And so I take for granted that everybody didn't get a chance to be immersed in Black literature and Black thinkers and intellectuals. But it's really a powerful experience to go backward and start reading some of the literature by people like James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Toni Morrison, even going all the way far back as Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, reading about people like Eli Whitney, who developed the cotton gin, or George Washington Carver, reading about the different perspectives and ideologies of W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. These are all important to understand, and coming all the way up to the present. So more current Black authors like Robert Jones Jr., who's also known as son of Baldwin, Brittany Cooper, and again, these other thinkers that are so pivotal in what we understand about Blackness right now. And then you want to prioritize Black voices as you learn from all perspectives. So if you're reading about Black people from non-Black people, you're still not getting a full perspective because they're not Black. You have to actually listen to and prioritize Black voices to speak about themselves. That is also a function of power, for you to assume as someone who is not in the community would know more about the community than the community itself, right? And from all perspectives. So, I do this frequently, partly because I'm a researcher. Pick folks who have the most extreme views you've ever heard, right? Just read it to understand. There was a time when what Malcolm X was talking about was completely radical, talking about defunding the police and police brutality. It sounded crazy in the 60s. And that's exactly what we're talking about right now. So sometimes it takes a while for certain perspectives to catch up, and sometimes they'll always be wrong, but you can't quite disagree with something you don't understand, right? So you also want to question, and I wrote a post about this. Everything you've learned about Black people more than likely has been totally wrong. Everything you see in the media, everything you learned about what Black people think, why Black people do what they do, if you didn't hear it from a Black person, which you probably didn't, it's probably wrong. And so it's up to you to start to question, why do I feel like that? Where did I hear that from, right? And unpack that. And then you want to document your bias and your new knowledge. So keep a journal, right? Or if you already have a journal, start to document this stuff and write it down and see trends, because that'll help you understand where your particular biases lie. And then finally, you want to pivot. So most people now, again, are doing this performative stuff. They got the big post on social media so 1 million people can like it. That's not really where you're going to have the most influence. Your influence is with your family, your friends, your loved ones, and your colleagues. Influence those people, have those difficult conversations, question why you don't have any Black friends, question why there are no Black people on your team, question why there are no Black managers in your office. Starting small will help you preserve your mental space, because then you don't have a million strangers shouting at you, but it'll also help you to be able to influence change. And then finally, choose a focus area and set goals. So you can't eat a whole pie once, you eat it piece by piece. So maybe you would just want to focus on like black media, right? I want to study the history of Black media portrayals in music. And so you start reading and you start ingesting literature and articles and things like that, and then set a goal about what you want to do in that area, and then keep chewing along with it until you start to get a better understanding. So what's next? I have an upcoming webinar series. There are actually 3 courses. So again, it's the longer version of what you just heard today. It's called Strong Foundations. And then there's a second course called Unlearning Anti-Blackness. It's deeper than the N word, where we start to dig into these cultural pain points that have become so mainstream, but showing that it's much deeper than that. And then finally, Unlearning Anti-Blackness, Making the Personal Sacrifice, where I'll talk to you about specifically how you can take action and influence other people to take action, to be able to actually unpack and unlearn their anti-Black perspectives, actions, and thoughts. And there is a discount available when you purchase all 3. There's a 10% discount on that. And so a little bit later, I'll show you my website, or give you the address for my website so you can know where to go purchase that. And I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you.
You.
It's Gina as well, my co-founder, who has joined us. And that was so powerful. And there were so many takeaways. I was taking notes the entire time. And even though this will be posted up later, I think that there's just so much to think about, and ways that was so actionable. So thank you. I really appreciate you giving us all of the 360 perspective, from the vocabulary to the history, to what we can do now, and how to really think about things in a linear path as well.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations. I can't believe this is the first time you've done this. You're so good at it.
Thank you so much.
Really impressive. So we have some Q&As, and I'd love to read them to you. And I really would appreciate if people want to add theirs in now. So the first one was from New York City. I'm a second shift member, and thank you so much for having this town hall. The glass ceiling has been difficult to crack. Can you share your comments on how frequently organizations should have team building around equity, specifically with the Black African American experience in mind?
That's an excellent question. And as a veteran HR leader and D&I leader, there's no easy answer. A huge part of this, and that's why I focus so much on unlearning, is about the constant work that you need to do. So maybe you might start with a series of town halls just to even hear from Black people. And then after that, you decide, okay, we want to have a quarterly session, or maybe monthly, given what's happening right now, or maybe even daily. The key is to keep your finger on the pulse and be willing to pivot and understand that what you need this month may be different than next month, may be different than next year.
And another question came up. I enjoy accents and dialects. When I'm around people from the South, I sometimes find myself unconsciously adopting some of their habits, like saying y'all or hun. When I'm with African Americans, I stop myself from unconsciously using any sort of dialect. For instance, I say, I agree, when I really want to use a phrase. What? I feel like dialect somehow is disrespectful. But I think when I'm using some sort of Southern dialect, it's even more disrespectful. It was a little bit of a muddled question, but
I actually get it. I think I get what they're saying.
I understand too. I get what she's trying to say, and just really like the idea of stopping yourself from saying something because you don't want to be offensive.
For sure. And it's around cultural appropriation.
Yeah, and really understanding the right usage and how that will be reflective or insulting to somebody.
Absolutely. You know, this is why I tell people to focus on their circle of influence. I'm the same way. I live in LA now. This is like my seventh city that I've lived in my life. I've been Detroit, Chicago, New York, the DMV, like all over. And so I tend to pick up accents and slang and stuff too. When you are focusing on your circle of influence, who knows you more deeply, who cares about you, you can avoid some of that pressure because they know you fully. If you are monitoring yourself and watching the way you speak or different mannerisms you have, that's good. You should be aware of how what you do will affect someone else. But I wouldn't necessarily focus as much on being afraid. I will focus more on what you said at the very beginning, which is I always pick up things about people. So in essence, what you're saying is you're highly adaptable and you're open to different cultures. So as you think about it and unpack it, you can check in with yourself periodically and say, okay, do I really like that slang, or am I doing that because I want to fit in and I feel insecure? And as you keep doing that check, it'll become easier to do the check and it won't be as laborious, but also you'll be able to make sure that you're always coming from an authentic place. Thanks for that question. That was good.
Kalyn, can I, for a second, just add to that? Being the mother of, one of my teenage boys, but I have another teenage boys, and some of what I consider cultural appropriation that these boys are, in some ways guilty of, comes from their worship of urban culture and I have to say this group of my kids never, I would hope, use words that seem racist or biased, but there is the slang and the dialect and the way of talking, and I know that it comes from them listening to hip hop and rap. And so how do I approach that in a way that doesn't seem like I'm being too bossy and above their age, but it does. He's staring at me right now.
I think I know the exact person that's probably staring at you.
No, the other one. It's the younger one, not the older one. The older one would never. It's the younger one. I'll put my mic on mute.
I think, no, that's a great question. And a lot of people struggle with that. This is where you do start to get into those intersectional identities, because as age hitting up with race and ethnicity, hitting up against cultural values, right? One thing you can do to start to unpack that is realize that a part of your concern is because when you first became aware of that phenomenon, it was because urban culture was very much taboo and really considered wrong. And so as your perspective of that has changed, where you're like, no, people are just living their culture and doing them, oh my gosh, are my kids taking over that? It's really your own insecurity based off of the way you learned that from the beginning. So this is when you start having a conversation with your kids about like, hey, do you know where the root of that perspective comes from? So you start to have conversations with them about the lyrics, right? Because contrary to what some people think, hip hop has a method. There's a method to the madness. And so when people are referencing in hip hop certain historical events or cultural things, hey, you know where that came from? Start having conversations with them about these historical events that led to those. And actually in the longer class, I'm going to talk about the stereotypes that emerged from each of those periods in history, so that you can understand some of the things that pop up in mainstream culture and why that became so taboo.
Can I just make them listen to 90s hip hop and know my little Uzi Vert?
Yeah, hopefully. But it's interesting because the hip hop today, and that's why I brought that up about the 2000s to the present, because the hip hop today is very much a victim of some of those, that same enmeshed erasure, where, like 90s hip hop, it was, again, very distinct. I mean, this is just like Black folks talking about stuff that's happening in Black neighborhoods and the Black experience. And so now when you get some of these other things that are a little bit more enmeshed and multicultural, they're like, wait, that isn't quite landing the same. It feels inauthentic and it feels offensive. And a part of that is because of that enmeshed erasure.
I have a question. This is Jenny. What I was going to ask is, I see it even in the questions, people not really understanding the correct vernacular to use. That's, without sounding like an old fogey. It's not really up to date on where the movement is. So can you explain the difference, people like women of color, African American, Black? What is the preference in this moment that we can make sure that people are are educated and want to be part of the right conversation.
For sure. So this is again going back to that intersectional identity because age has a lot to do with that. You know, my grandmother, rest her soul, when she was young, I remember even when I was younger, sometimes she would refer to Black people as Negroes because she was born in 1931 in Virginia and then lived in West Virginia. And that was literally how Black people were termed on every major form. And then it was colored. And then it was Black. And then it was like, no, it's African American. And then it kind of got back to Black. And then now it's a mix of things, right? And people of color has become much more common. So that goes back to that flexibility in being an ally. I would say take the lead from the Black person that you're talking to. So if you hear them say Black, right? Or if you hear them say African American, you kind of just parrot what they say. For me personally, I've always loved Black because Black is inclusive of African people and the entire what is called diaspora. Diaspora are all the people from African descent who are living in places all over the world. So Black is inclusive of African, African American, Afro-Caribbean, and any, again, person of African descent in the same umbrella. But to that point, if you're speaking about, and you're in New York, so I know you'll know because there's so many mixes of people there, you're speaking about someone who is of Afro-Caribbean or Afro Latina descent or Latinx descent, they may want to be specifically called Afro-Latinx or Afro-Caribbean or from their particular nationality. So again, you just want to be sensitive and be flexible, but Black would probably be a good lead-in word, specifically if you're talking about Black people, because it is becoming more common to hear people of color as an erasure of the very specific issues that Black people face in fighting against anti-Blackness that other groups of color do not have to deal with in the same way.
I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide so we can talk about that, since there's no other questions unless anyone wants to throw one up there now. And we can talk about what you're up to and what your consulting business and got scheduled for the next few weeks, so people can spread the word, come back and come back and attend if there's more questions or more interest.
For sure. So this is the consulting slide, but I can pause for a second and let me actually stop share because I'll show you all my website where you can go to purchase tickets for the event. So let me do that.
So you'll be doing an event, I believe it's tomorrow.
Actually, Saturday. There are two. So it's course 1 and 2 Saturday, and then there's a session of course 3 on Monday, and then it's like in another round. So you can mix it up. You can come to them in any order. You can come to them on any date that you prefer. And I tried to mix up the times for people in different time zones too.
And we saw course 1 today.
Yes, this was the abridged version of course 1. So there's going to be even more content in course 1 that will be held on when course 1 is happening, and there are 3 sessions of each. So when you go to my website, it's godreamforward.com. It's going to start at Quick Wins, which is my blog page. So I'll write about HR, D&I, and career development topics, as well as some research. I have a research project I'm going to be coming out with around the pandemic's impact on Detroit, the disproportionate impact. But you will click events, and then it's going to pop up and allow you to register. Of course, it's not doing what I need to do right now.
Of course
because
not.
We're on a time schedule.
Yeah, of course not.
It's because Jenny's on.
Yeah.
Right. Here it is. So
there we
this
go.
is where you can register, and you would select the course, and then you would pay through PayPal, register, give your name and email, and then you'll get a confirmation. And all of the session links with the passcodes will be sent about an hour before the session begins. So you're going to get a couple reminders, but they're not going to have the link in there yet. And then you'll get the link at the right before the course begins. And then you can also choose to buy the package.
Oh, very
so
cool.
Each individual session is $79. If you were to buy each one individually, that'll be $237, but I'm giving a 10% discount if you buy the package all at once, and it's $209. And then you'll get a code that's sent to you, and you go back and have to register for each session individually, and you would just enter that code, and it's good for registering for one of each session. And again, that's a 10% discount.
I love it. And I also want to point out that you do this for corporate clients as well.
Correct.
And if anybody out there is interested in having Kalyn come and do this for an abridged version or the entire series for your groups or your company, that's part of her offering as her independent consulting business.
Correct. And if you want me to work with you on D&I strategy as well. So I work with companies through Second Shift to be able to offer them, like, if you're like, we're at square one with D&I, we don't even know what we're doing. I can come and help you set up your D&I team, your D&I department. If you want a systems analysis of your HR systems and how that's impacting D&I, I'm happy to come in and do that for you all, as well as individual career coaching for your high potential employees from underrepresented groups who you want to position for upcoming promotions or opportunities in the company.
That's amazing.
I want to reference what you said earlier about the twos and fews, and how important that is for people to acknowledge that is unacceptable. And
for sure,
you have so much to teach our corporate clients and the corporate world out there.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I guess, thank you. There's your website. There's all your information. I am so honored that you did this today. And oh wait, we see a hand raised, so maybe we have another question.
I know I'm giving everybody for Father's Day this year.
Wait a second. Oh, you've gotten so many amazing people who have Black-owned businesses. Okay, wait. We have a lot more Q&A that just came in.
Okay.
We keep going?
Yes, that's fine. I can go until about 10, 15.
Keep going. We'll keep going. So I'm saying, do you have any resources you can recommend for folks on learning how to decenter individual conversations and organizational structures?
You know what's interesting? I thought about putting together a reading list, and I was like, I'm going to do it. And then I said no, because I want people to be empowered and stretch through the discomfort to find your own sources. And it's going to be different for everybody. If you're in the entertainment industry, go find people who have written about that. They are out there. Again, the key is to prioritize Black voices across all spectrum of thought, because then you'll get a well-rounded perspective and you can synthesize the information and come to some conclusions. You can do this. I know it's difficult to get started. It's scary, but you can absolutely do this.
What about people who are scared to start the conversation at work? That's what I'm hearing. How do you start talking to your boss about allyship? How do you start this conversation at work?
For sure. So usually in team meetings, or like you have a one-on-one with your boss or something like that, you can bring up, again, focus on your locus of control. Hey, we are supposed to meet 5 new clients in a month. I was thinking I want to bring some more Black potential clients into that mix. I'm thinking of going out and reaching out through such and such channel. Is that okay with you? And then if you see pushback, that's the conversation to start. If they say, oh my gosh, that's a great idea, I was thinking of that, that's how you start the conversation. But you want to start small in the circles where you can influence. And sometimes it's better to show rather than tell. So instead of telling people you're taking action, just take it. And then when people start seeing the impact, then they'll be like, oh, wait a minute, hold on, what you doing? How did you do that? How did you make that happen?
Another question about intersectionality. I'm curious why you don't also include age, because older Black women are hardest hit economically and they have the least opportunity for employment.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I'm sorry that I did not include age, because yes, that is a huge impact. And I experienced that even in my personal life. I was traveling for work to a conference last year, and it was Essence Fest. So it was like all Black people on this plane. And it was 2 older women. We were in tears talking about rent. And I was saying, oh, my rent is so high and it's so irritating to pay it. And I remember them telling me, the fact that as a Black woman, you can even afford to pay that kind of rent shows us that what we put in work to make sure you can have a seat at the table worked. And it was this really emotional moment, because I thought about how when I was a kid, my mother struggled to pay rent, and our rent was $360, right? That it went up from $330 to $360. And she was like really struggling to even function, to think about how she was going to do this. So thank you for that call out. Age absolutely has a huge impact. And I personally push with my clients and at every job I've had to have these organizational think tanks of older employees to have their voices heard, because I think that's such an important part of recognition and rewards, and also for being able to maintain consistency and continuity in service, because that organizational knowledge and cultural knowledge is invaluable.
Okay, we got another one. Thank you for an outstanding presentation.
Thank
How
you.
critical, got to give you the props. How critical is it for corporate boards to broaden their membership based on diversity and inclusion beyond one or two women of color in particular? On a personal level, I've not been able to break through the ceiling. I appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the things that I advise corporate clients is about starting junior advisory boards or other, again, think tanks to start getting that influence. Because to be on any board, you have to already come with connections, with capital, with influence. Like there are things you have to have in the bag in order to sit at the table, and that's not going to change. So instead of just trying to find these needles in the haystack, start building that influence early. So get people visible, get people influential to give their thoughts, even at a small level. And then from there, when we start to pick, okay, who do I want on the board? This person has already built the social and possibly even financial capital to be able to sit there.
That's really good advice. Thinking a little bit smaller than and starting
Yeah.
bite-sized things that
Yeah.
can.
And it helps drive change in the organization faster, right? Because a lot of boards, they might meet once a month unless it's a crisis. That's not fast enough to drive, that's not frequent enough to drive consistent change. So with these smaller junior advisory boards, they could be meeting once a week sometimes. They could be meeting just informally all the time and keeping the conversation going. So
Terrific.
it's a win-win.
Okay, this one's really interesting. Thank you so much for this. I'm so happy you gave us actionable items, and I will be starting my journal. One of the things that stood out to me as a Chicagoan who used to work with kids in the high-rise projects was that I noticed cultural diffusion as they moved out to the burbs and neighborhoods that were not so condensed.
Correct.
Address the people who compare that to Irish, Polish, Russian, etc., and other ethnic cultural diffusions. This is this is a conversation I have had with the quote all lives matter quote people.
I love that. I lived in Chicago for 7 years. It is where I started my career, and I started it in social services, working with former housing project residents and youth in exactly the same situations that you're talking about. And the way, first of all, I don't engage in arguments with people. I simply state facts. And you can either accept the facts and we can continue the conversation, or you can dispute the facts. And so I already know where you're coming from, period. The fact is, in Chicago specifically, the very formation of the housing projects in and of itself made it very different than what happened to specifically European ethnic communities. So Black people were by and large herded into these long strips of housing projects where they were denied opportunity. And that was a purposely engineered system. You may want to consider reading a book called Boss. It's about Richard J. Daley and his tenure as Chicago mayor. He was mayor for like 30 years. It's very, very interesting. It's fascinating. I actually had to read it for one of my graduate classes at DePaul. Also, when you think about the way the housing projects were torn down, also systemic, where people were purposely displaced and families and communities were completely torn apart by the police and by the Chicago Housing Authority on purpose to break up that culture. And again, that also happened in ways that is completely different than European ethnic communities and even other non-Black communities of color, in that they were able to organically move up and move out through building social and financial capital, largely on the back of being government employees. So when you think about the makeup of the police force, the fire department, and other government entities in Chicago, it is overwhelmingly of Irish and Italian descent, especially through most of the 20th century. And those were jobs with pensions and other benefits that made it easier to do things like buy property, invest, and create a sense of stability that Blacks were systematically shut out of.
It's a fantastic answer. Thank you for that perspective and the history. Okay, now this one's a little bit specific. I'm creating a Black-owned and people of color-owned business listing in my county. I've drafted a letter to ensure people want to be included, and I'm doing research via Google, and I'm wanting to avoid asking my Black friends in the area to rely on myself to get it done. Happy to do it imperfectly, but as a white woman of privilege, is this an area where I do want to invite my Black friends for input? Huge thanks for this.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is draining Black people right now is being asked to do the labor rather than give input. So it's a difference if you say, hey, come help me do this, which is something that you're probably going to own and get the credit for creating, and they will simply be helpers, versus saying, hey, look, y'all, I created this thing. I'm about to launch it and let it go live. can you look this over and see, did I miss anything? Because I don't know if I quite have the most well-rounded perspective on this. Asking for input on something that's already built means that they're doing far less labor than if they have to help you start it. So that actually may help a lot more and show, again, we talked about the pillars of allyship, might show that you're much more committed to being an ally because you've already done the work.
Okay, I think we've taken up enough of your time. We've got all the questions. We really appreciate it. I can't even tell you all of the comments of people just saying how wonderful this was. Kalyn for president.
Oh, wow. I don't know about that.
And just really how charismatic, informative, and engaging you are. So for your first ever presentation, thank you for doing it here for the second shift. It was a true honor. And I thank you on behalf of all of the member community, for Gina, for Kemp, and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much.
And let's give a shout out to Chris Hadley.
Yes, please.
Who
Yes.
created the presentation for you and helped out, and really is just an amazing person. So
yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
I really enjoyed working with you.
I know what I'm giving everybody for Father's Day now. Everybody's getting an allyship workshop.
Yes,
so
you should. Yes.
It's going to be the present for this whole summer.
Thank you.
And to the person who asked if you're interested in corporate coaching for teams, we've addressed that. You have the information, and we'll be following up by sending the link to this session as well as the information for everything ongoing and all of your personal business information.
For
Follow up. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Thanks for joining. We really appreciated it.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.